So getting back to how Mouse ruined comics.
Okay.
Your 3 seconds are up. No more boom.
Stop right there, criminal scum.
Why, hello. Hey, Internet, it's Wednesday. It's another episode of the Mattriarchy. It's the 199th episode of the show. Can you believe it? I know. 200 weeks, give or take. Next week, it's our 200th show. Which is nuts, if you ask me. It's just madness. It's utterly insane.
I've completely lost track of how many shows I've done over on my podcast between the original one that we did years ago and then the comeback. It's like I have no idea. It's got to be over 400 by now, but
yeah. Well, folks, it's a ponytail up day. It's just warm enough in my room that I don't want the hair on my neck, so it's a ponytail up day for me. But yeah, I only know how many shows we've had because I picked the convention of numbering them back in the day, and I stuck with it. Even though everyone says you number shows, if you have some sort of weird numbering convention, it doesn't hit the algorithm the same, and you're not going to get the spread. And dude, I do a 1 to 2 hour talking heads program about comic books from a conservative and classical perspective. I'm going to have a small window anyway.
Yeah, I used to number my shows way back. I think we even hit maybe 200 the first time. I don't remember. And then even when we came back, I numbered them. Somewhere along the way, I think it was last summer when we were doing daily shows. And then when we stopped the podcast portion and strictly went live, I'm done numbering. I'm just going to name the show the date. Whatever the date is, people can know that was the day we did the show.
Yeah, if I really wanted it spread, I'd say you wouldn't believe what happened next or something like that. Those clickbaity titles. Doug Tenaple did an experiment with his show when he got his channel back, where he was just like, this happened in public, like the worst clickbait, like obviously clickbait titles,
the most insane thing you'll ever see.
Yeah, and then like people were calling him on it, and they said, "Why this is so cheap?" And his response on Twitter, he said, "Of course it's cheap, but it works, and the whole point is it working. I know it, and you know it, so let's not pretend." Like, yeah, that's savage, man, but I can't argue. But I don't know. I picked my thing and went with it. So it is an AMA, an Ask Me Anything, a questions and answers show where you, the viewer at home, can ask us, the panel, and whoever else might show up, pithy questions, and I will attempt to answer them in my own particular idiom, which is I say things with the gravitas of authority, and then other people think I'm being demeaning and condescending. That's how that shakes out. But I don't know.
It's fitting, just like Sir Lancelot.
Yes, exactly. Little Monty Python joke there. So, the first question, Tony Sizzle asks, how the fuck do you put up with children for a living? It's a show. I may drop some bombs. How do I do? I don't know. I just I was talking to Metal about it. Was that we were backstage as we were getting ready to go live, and the fact of the matter is I have been involved in youth work professionally since 2004, and since I was 26, and I think part of what helped was that I was working with homeless youth, and I was a formerly homeless youth who had, in fairly recent memory, been through all of it. and so that was, I think that was the ticket. It had been lived for me, and I've made it an effort never to forget that young people, young adults, are teenagers are just really crappy adults. They have all the same drives, they have all the same ambitions, they have many of the same skills, but they're terrible at using all of them. And so I just treat young people like unfinished, uncompleted, in process adults, and let them own their own choices and maintain professional boundaries, and that's sort of that. So if a kid gets mad and screws up their own lives, and then comes to me and says, "What happened?" and I'll say, "Well, you screwed up your own life."
Yeah. I think it probably also helps to remember that their hormones are out of whack. So it's kind of like you just left the tricycle and you went to your first bike, right? But for some reason, the gear shift just keeps changing on its own. So eventually you'll get the hang of driving this thing around, but it's going to be a pain in the butt at first.
Yeah. Well, nobody's good. Okay. And so here's the thing this is a personal pet peeve of mine. Yeah. When people try to pull out you can't expect teenagers to do, this, they're immature. Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Of course they are. Like nobody knows what they're doing.
Expect them to do things.
Right. But nobody knows what they're doing, right? So people are like, it's the similar game where somebody says, "Oh, I'm not I don't think I'm mature enough for children." Or I'm not ready for a serious romantic relationship. Well, you know what? You're never mature enough. You're never ready. Everybody is making it up as they go.
In many ways, it's the act of raising children that matures you. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's putting yourself in the position to have to do the thing and then doing it, because you can never prepare. You can never have enough money. You can never have enough time. You can never have enough preparation. And if all you do is spend your time preparing, then you're never going to do it. And so I formalized this in a little adage that I came up with about 15 years ago. Well, not quite 15, probably 13 years ago. It's the idea that there's no chance for success without a chance for real failure. And so it's important to let people fail. And so that's kind of my theory with youth work, is try to set up a scenario, is try to encourage scenarios where kids have a chance to fail in a way that's safe. So those failures have as minimal negative consequences as possible, but are also the learning experiences they need to move to that next step of independence. And that's how we work at it, is just one step at a time, one day at a time.
Oh yeah.
That's how it works.
I could take it from a martial arts perspective. You can run drills all day, but you're not ready to get punched in the face until it happens to you.
This is true. And it's true for fighting. It's true for fixing a car. It's true for getting a job. It's true for every situation in life. And so as many opportunities as young people have, and I think it's true for adults too, right? It's not just like, oh, hey, I'm 19 and suddenly I don't need this type of learning anymore. No, you learn to walk in the same way you learn to talk to girls. One step, one stumble, one failure, one stride at a time. So
yeah, it was like a lot of it's not even just martial arts, a lot of just like any athletic or stunt related activity. First thing you do, you learn to fall, because you're not going to avoid it. You're gonna fall sometime. You better at least know how to do it right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. The question Dave asks, do you prefer a clean comic shop or a messy comic shop where you have to dig? I prefer more messy than neat. Okay.
Organized chaos.
I like I like the messy shop as long as I have the time to go through the boxes, right? I like going through long boxes that aren't sorted and like discovering things. Like that's awesome. Like finding the neat new thing. Every once and again, I get skunked with something that I didn't expect. Right. One time, I think I've mentioned this on stream before. It's sort of embarrassing. I picked up a Robin Hood and his Merry Men comic that I thought was just, a retelling of the Robin Hood story, and I didn't look at the bottom half of the cover closely enough. I picked it up and I read through it, and I'm like, this is as queer as can be. It's the gayest book I've ever read.
I think they took the Mary part in all the wrong directions.
That's exactly what it was. That's exactly what it was. And if you had looked closely at the cover, it's kind of obvious. But I just looked at the title. I saw the Robin Hood character. It was $1. I put it in my cart and I bought the thing.
Yeah, it must have been written by a Norman.
I don't know who wrote it, but okay. There we go. I don't know. It was irritating though, just because like I felt bamboozled, but who did the real bamboozle was me.
It's like we're gonna keep taxing you people, you fairies, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Everybody pays the tax, man. Anyhow, so that was. But other than that funny story, I do love the messiness of that. But I gotta have the time, and it's got to be something where I'm not looking for something specifically, right? Because I would love to go through the dollar bins to fill in some of those either rare issues that
Hold
I don't
on
necessarily.
A second.
What? Oh, okay. I love to fill in some of those back issues or stuff that might need the. He just walked off there with a hatchet.
Oh, somebody needed to borrow my hatchet.
Oh, okay. It's just like you get up, and you're like, just a second, I'll be right back, and then you walk in and this way, and then it's hatchet. He has a hatchet.
Yeah.
Anyway, like I was saying,
it's normal stuff for me.
Yeah. Like I said, I love going through the dollar bins and stuff to find those battered beauties, those haggard used comics. But if I'm looking for something to fill in a blank spot in my collection, I'd love to rather pay $1 for something that I'm going to just read in anyway. But I cannot stand. I mean, if I'm looking for something particular and I can't find it, if it's not like in the right order, oh man, that gets me mad. So I like the stores that have kind of the mess to them. I think it adds to that newsprint feel of a comic shop. But I also like being able to find what I'm looking for quick. So depending on what I'm out shopping for the day, I'll go to either kind of store. Now, so there you go. So.
See, I don't know why. He said, I have to go outside and fight something real quick. Can I use your hatchet? I'm like, I don't know why, of all the things in this room, they would choose the unsharpened hatchet when I've got like 10 other sharpened weapons around. Like, they could have just came over and borrowed this, like this would have done the job. Or I have a machete over there. Like, of all things to pick the hatchet.
Well, I don't know. Maybe it was it's a duel and the other guy already picked hatchets as weapons.
Yeah, it's just to be fair.
Yeah. So choose your weapon. I choose hatchets. Well, I don't even have a hatchet. Metal, you got a hatchet?
Of course I do.
Yeah,
obviously.
I have 3.
Yeah, I said hatchet, machete. I've got like 3 wakizashi. I've got like a katana around here. I've got a bastard sword over there. I've got like 2 pairs of nunchucks. There's like tons of stuff around here.
I only have 2 hatchets, and an axe. But the axe is technically a long-term lend from my father-in-law. Yeah. Anyhow,
I've got like a claw hammer over there somewhere too. That's a pretty functional weapon.
Yeah. Oh, claw hammer can do some real damage. Hey, moving on. We got a question. So, Matt, how'd you get the lead of the Fray on stream? I assume she means the metal that you resemble the lead singer for the Fray. I don't know.
Maybe.
So maybe as he moved down, we'll have to get on here. We got another question in the chat from Star Storyteller.
What I get all the time, though, is that people tell me for some reason I look like Rob Halford, who is the lead singer of Judas Priest.
Okay. Yeah. You're a little young for that, but sure.
Yeah. I get told I look like a young Rob Halford and that I'm aging into an old Rob Halford. So
thanks, I guess.
Yeah.
Why do you think culture at large will push back on driving behavior, but not on sexually promiscuous behavior? And Dave retorts that what culture is pushing back on drivers, especially definitely not American culture. Except, Dave, I think you're actually wrong on here. There's the number of young people that aren't anxious to get their driver's license is ridiculously high. Kids that aren't testing until they're almost in end of high school, or even having any interest in driving until the idea of moving out starts to turn on in their heads.
I just never felt the need to have a license to drive.
Yeah. That's a crime.
I know.
But back to Star's question. It's because, and here's the thing is, I honestly believe this is true, and I don't think people actually think about it. Driving is the kind of risk that makes people free.
Right? Oh, I was going to say something very similar.
Right.
Yeah.
Driving is the kind of risk that makes people free. It's to paraphrase that line from Pirates of the Caribbean, a car is freedom. Being able to get to where you want, when you want it, and being able to, and even more, if you learn how to fix your car, it's a whole nother level of freedom. And we don't teach kids mechanics in school anymore and all that kind of stuff. And they've made cars prohibitively difficult to work on in a lot of ways too. And so we're driving and mechanics are dangers that make a person free, but sex is a danger that makes you that ties you down and connects you, right? And sexual promiscuity and porn and all that kind of stuff, it detracts from freedom, because either you're looking, and so I think that's the ticket. Is I think we have a culture that encourages dependence, and so rather than over freedom, and it even masks it as freedom, right? But it's still
that's what I was going to simply just put. Shorter words is one actually grants you freedom, the other gives you the illusion of it.
Yeah. And so, Star mentions for teenagers particularly, but I think it's more than that. I think it actually gets into, like, it's a lot bigger picture. Like, I was just arguing on the internet, a great hobby for anyone, with some pro-aborts, who were insistent on the idea that we have to have abortion because, teenagers and preteens aren't mature enough to raise children. Well, no, of course they're not. But there are like 20 couples looking to adopt for every kid available for adoption, like in this country. Like, if you're can't take care of a kid, somebody will take care of your child. People are looking for infants for that. So,
I also feel like that is that's a generational problem. Trying to move away from the older culture of the extended family and moving towards that nuclear family idea, because teens have never been mature enough to raise children, but they've been doing it forever because they also used to live with the grandparents that would help, even like at the age of 16. Like they were always in like a nest of a family that would be teaching you what to do and stuff.
Right, and even in the nuclear family idea, where you have nuclear families that are still living in proximity to their community, right? So the ideal homestead situation where your son builds a house on the other side of the property, and they can they've got their house, but they can come over on Sundays for chicken dinner, and they have their own place to escape to still.
Yeah, but they've been pushing further and further, right? Because at least the extended family started out with it still being on the same property, but maybe having your own houses. Nuclear is like, well, at least you might still be in the same neighborhood. But over time, it's like, it's weird that you still live in the same city as your parents. Why don't you move away?
Right. Well, and I think part of that's the idea of the cultural move against like small towns and against country life, right? The idea that everybody's got to go to the big city for their opportunities, and that's is a ridiculous holdover from the Industrial Revolution. We don't even hardly have factories anymore, and the idea of clustered living like that just doesn't necessarily make sense. Makes sense if you ask me.
Yeah.
So, of course, I'm living, in rural Nebraska, working for a nonprofit, making, less,
Yeah.
less than the national median. I'll tell you that much right now. We're doing okay. I mean, we own our house, we own our car. I can walk to work. I had to because I broke my bike this week. A bicycle. Yeah, it was a whole thing. Anyway.
See, that's another form of freedom, though, because you want something unlike a modern car that's easy for you to learn how to repair. Just get a bicycle. As long as it's within bicycling distance, you can go anywhere. And depending on who you are, I mean, cross-country could be bicycling distance.
So, question, if you've put the Wolfman on a rocket and sent to the moon, would he be a werewolf all the time? I'm assuming you mean the universal.
Yeah, like a werewolf.
Yeah.
Right? I would assume.
Well, because not all werewolf lore is consistent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The way reflections work. If he's on the moon, and he's on any side of the moon that would be bright enough to be full, he would also be in direct sunlight, which would probably negate him being a werewolf.
Ooh, that's a really good point.
Because you don't become a werewolf when it's a full moon during the daytime, only at night.
That's very good point. So he would have to be like in the twilight section of the moon.
But then it wouldn't be a full moon.
It wouldn't be a full. Oh, it wouldn't be a full moon at all.
Yeah, I think you'd have to be on a planet to be a werewolf. You couldn't on a moon. Unless that moon had another moon in the distance that you could see a full moon from.
Or does the lunar reflection off the Earth?
Yeah. What if you get a full view of the Earth? Maybe that would send him into it.
That's fascinating. I feel like I should write this as a story.
But then you'd have to be on what is basically at the time the darkened side of the moon. Not the dark side, which is the side we don't see because it's tidally locked, but the sun has to be behind you to get that reflection,
Yeah. Huh. Star Storyteller says Rob Harford was an awesome guy. I assume you mean guy. Very
maybe not.
Or maybe he does mean gay. Could be. I don't know. Push back against the Chick-fil-A bans. And I assume you mean bans without the D.
Because having gay and Chick-fil-A in the same sentence would add some context.
Yeah. So Dave says he's radicalized against cars and has to leave. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I feel that way, Dave. I will say that even though I believe that the American cult of the automobile, and I mean that in like the scholastic sense of cult, is an important and vital thing, right? The whole, gearhead, culture and all that kind of stuff. I think it's
a vital part of the
Americana, and it's very important. At the same time, I think the idea of the 15-minute city, 15-minute village is not opposed to that idea, and should be more used in city planning. I think the fact that we have designed our cities like strip malls negates, it really hurts poor people and inhibits people from being able to partake of the long haul lifestyle of people. Like, because here's part of the thing is people spend all their time. This is why I love living in a little town, right? My whole town's 5 miles across. It's not a 15-minute town. It's a 2-hour town, but still, right? And interesting fact, Scottsbluff has almost the exact footprint as Washington, D.C., and like a tenth of the population. But I think the idea of what I love about small town America is the fact that like you can walk anywhere, and it's a mistake that we in our town make is almost everybody drives everywhere, even though it would be healthier to walk some of the places.
So I think of bigger cities, I think Dallas is actually a good example of how one should be structured. It's got its smaller areas where you can just walk anywhere, but it has to have plenty of parking in any case because people need to get to the other areas. So they have a difference between what are like local roads and passing roads. So basically everybody has to be able to get to a passing road, which will get you to the other side of town. But you could walk there anywhere else. You could go to a bus stop. You could go to a train station. So Dallas is a good example of city structure. Wolf. I think it is compared to other cities I've been to.
Well, and like Denver is kind of accidentally that way too, because Denver was Denver, and there were all of these like country towns around it, and then all the country towns got bigger and bigger and bigger and kind of merged into that. But each of the little towns, toward the middle of them, try to keep their old town flair, and so at the city center of Longmont and Aurora and Arvada, they try to maintain like a walking spaces and green spaces in there, and on the borders it's tract housing and highways between each of the suburbs. And sometimes that works in some suburbs, that works really well, where you can feel really comfortable in those neighborhoods, and in some it's really cramped and dirty and poorly designed from road system to road system. So Denver's kind of a mess, but they were definitely going for something like that. But I still would rather live out here in the sticks and tell those city folk to stay the hell away from me.
I kind of like living on the border between the two. That way I can kind of just go where I want to go at any point in time.
Yeah. Well, and that's the other thing that's nice about the small town is that, we're a 15-minute drive from the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
So, whereas like when my dad used to live in Denver,
fast if I want.
He'd have to drive 2 hours to get out of the city.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous.
The Hiroshi says, shut-in family deemed Dallas traffic a worse endpoint than hell itself. Well, I would only agree if we're talking specifically on highway traffic, not the pass over or streets, but the pass through roads. The highway traffic's horrible, but you're probably going to get that in like any major city where people work in the city and live elsewhere. A lot of the inner traffic is fine. Like I can walk anywhere during rush hour and have no issue. But like try getting in and out of the city and you're doomed. It's not happening. Yeah.
Downtown Denver, downtown Lincoln, downtown Omaha are all very walk friendly. They have park and rides all over, and you can get anywhere in any of those downtowns easily. Yeah. But do not expect to drive into the city.
Yeah. But like I could take a neighboring city, right? I could take Fort Worth, for example. And when it comes to the actual internal roads and city planning, it tries to do everything that Dallas does, but worse because it's an older city. It was a city before Dallas had built up to that level. So it was not set up to do half the stuff that Dallas does. It kind of like fractioned outward earlier on.
Yeah. Hiroshi says, I'm worthless at fixing cars or anything else. Wish to become a mechanic or plumber instead of going to college because we're already worthless and unhireable.
Yeah,
First of all, I hate to hear that. Second of all, don't let it stop you. It's never too late to learn how to fix things. It's a lot of things in the world are easy to fix with a little bit of trying. And if you've ever played around with an erector set or Legos, you have all of the skills to begin learning. It's not easy as that.
No, it's not.
Those are the skills you need to begin learning. And
well, especially if you get an older vehicle. It's talked about earlier being radicalized against cars. I'm radicalized against like anything made after like 95 at the latest, but even then you're already getting some computer chips. But a car from the 80s where like computer chips weren't even put in there. Anything from that or before, because you could like take apart the engine, find other parts for it, put it back together yourself. There's like don't need any weird devices to do maintenance.
Even with some of the ones with computers on them, if they're crude enough, you can test them with a multimeter and figure out what's wrong with the computer itself. But that takes some special instructions. And the older or the newer cars get, the less and less people have tinkered and figured out those behind the scenes things. So
And that is true about Fort Worth. So many small cities mixed in between. Kind of Dallas too. Like Oak Cliff used to be its own city, but it's just a like borough of Dallas now. But like I used to live in Hearst, which was what was it, Hearst? No, I didn't live in Hearst. I heard another place with an H. I'm trying to remember. It's gonna bother me. But I used to live in a small city that's part of Fort Worth, but it is Fort Worth, but it's its own section, and public transit kind of goes around it to some degree, and it was very annoying. Hewlett.
Here's an interesting conspiracy theory. I'm way behind in the chat, guys, so bear with me. I think the house market is just like the diamond market, a total ruse to get people to buy more houses away from their families. I can't argue with that. But I think it's more complicated than that. But I definitely think there is a play in that. Just because the more you're separated, the more you have to depend upon banks instead of upon your family to help you with figure out those things and equity.
I think it's a just inevitable consequence of building everything on growth.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's probably a factor in that. Hiroshi, I don't know where you live, everything here is way too far apart to walk or bike. To 99.9% of the places you need to go, the idea of being able to walk to work or school is a fantastical concept to me. I get that, and that's one of the things. Like
I walk everywhere.
Looking at the last few years, I've really become infatuated with the idea of new urbanism, the idea of these cities that are designed to have the grocery store, the mechanic shop, they're designed like a small town, and the city to be built so that you don't have, a residential district and a commercial district, and maybe heavy industry's got its own place within the city, but a lot of those other kind of places that they're intermingled, they're mixed zone design, and I think I find a lot of appeal for that, but I also don't think that has to be divorced from road culture, or that it should be.
Yeah, so and Hiroshi's right. It's Hewlett's a street. It's not that was the street I was on. Bedford, I think, is the name of the actual area that I was in. I think that's what Hewlett's on. I lived in an apartment there for a while. I hated living there because I still walked everywhere, but there just wasn't like anywhere to walk to. It was a horrible place to live. I'm glad I don't live there. The only good thing about it is on Hewlett Street was a Wild West comic that used to be a Lone Star comic. Right? Mm-hmm. So I could walk there. But it was like the only place I could go. There was also like the Hewlett Mall over there, right across the street. But it was just like, eh.
Yeah. I'm definitely a person who I have a sign up in my office, or it used to be up in my office, and it will be again when I finish getting it remodeled. It says, if you have the time, isn't everywhere within walking distance. So Star is taking off. Jim Tuner says that the housing market in Dallas is rigged. Their investors deliberately driving up house prices. I think that's happening nearly everywhere, and I don't think it's just the housing developers either. At least not here in Scottsbluff County. If there's anything I don't like about where I live, it's the fact that the county consistently decides that my house is more valuable than it is. And so they consistently decide that I owe them more in taxes because, this little house that I spent am spending less than 50 grand on is suddenly a $90,000 house. Like, as if I could sell it for that.
I'd say it is particularly a problem for Dallas proper than some of the surrounding areas, but I think that's also going to be particularly a problem for any major city than it is for some of the surrounding areas, but everyone is suffering from that.
So Hiroshi says, and this is actually a really interesting talking point because it's definitely a factor. My old small town once upon a time had stuff like a grocery store and a couple of restaurants, but the city ended up being really poor and couldn't support them anymore, and everything died, which is a valid concern. In fact, around here, like I live in the urban center of West Nebraska. We've got like 40,000 people in our county, so it's not a ton, but people come in here to shop from Wyoming, from Colorado, even some from South Dakota. Some, or they're coming through for whatever else. So our Walmart or whatever gets a lot of business, and we have some mom and pop shops and all that kind of stuff too. But the groceries in like Morrill and Mitchell, which are 10 and 20 miles from town respectively, or Minutair 10 miles the other way, they didn't make it, right? Because people they couldn't compete with Walmart, even though they're having in there. Now, shockingly, Dollar Generals around here are being able to compete because they don't sell as many things, but they sell enough of those cheap things that
Yeah.
the urban center of West Nebraska is an oxymoron. Yes, it is.
Well, I know the town I grew up in used to have a local grocery store for a
Mhm.
really long time. And I think it closed and reopened a few times. And I think the last time it closed was just before we moved into town. But right around the time like Walmart finally came through, even like the mid-sized grocery stores, all the other ones closed up except maybe Kroger. But even they killed the Kmart that was there. And you couldn't even see a Target for years until they just became bigger as a corporate company that they could sustain anything. Walmart just like killed everything in the town.
Yeah.
Now the original grocery store is a pizza parlor, but at least is locally owned. And I knew those people before they even moved to that location from the town over. Really good. I've been eating there since I was like 9 or 10.
So it's actually interesting. One of the original grocery stores that had just closed down when I moved to the area, Gering is the town just south of us on the other side of the river. It's part of the same community. One of the grocery stores that had been in that town had closed down just before I moved to town. It was like the old Safeway, and they had built a new Safeway, and they had been another grocer in there, and they didn't make it. And this building has been a model train club. It's been a tumbling, like a gymnastics club, all kinds of stuff that's been in this building. It's now a Dollar General. But yeah, Dollar Generals do thrive in poor areas. We have several. Actually, there's two in Bluffs. No, there's one in Scotts Bluff. Oh, there are two. There's two in Bluffs, one in Gering, one in Mitchell. There is one in Alliance, one in Kimball, one in Minutair. And they're working it out. They're making it work, and they're jobs for people. And it's not as I don't think they have the same cost investment as a proper grocery store, but they're able to sell other things and enough to justify their existence. So
there was one I missed. It wasn't local technically, but also it was Brahms, the creamery. They used to have grocery stores in there, and I used to go there to pick up like eggs and milk and stuff.
Yeah, they used to. They were all over the place when I lived down that way. Yeah, I was down in northeastern Oklahoma from 1980 up until 88? It was 88. So
No, yeah, we still have Brahms. They just don't really have groceries in them anymore. Not for the most part.
Jim says, explain Plainview's Animal Clown Festival since you are from Nebraska. Well, I have never been to Plainview, so I don't know anything about the Clown Festival. It seems like something I should have to investigate, along with going to Hastings Kool-Aid Days one of these years. So those are some things that apparently I need to figure out. The Clown
Unless
Festival.
they started putting them back in them. Because I know like all the ones around me that used to have their groceries ended up closing down. There's one down not too far from where I am, but it doesn't have a grocery in it.
On the subject of weird little things from Nebraska, I will tell a story from just a couple of weeks ago. Now, we moved up here in the 88, and then I was gone for 2 years. My family moved to Denver, which sucked. And then I was in Arkansas at college for a year. And I came back after that. I came back after that and couch surfed and ended up meeting a girl and getting married and having kids. And I've been here since. So I've been here for most of my life up here in the Panhandle. And this year, I found out that in Crawford, which is about an hour and a half north of here, they have had for 60 years a fiddle competition that I had never heard of. And my boy went to school up in Shadron and knew some folks who knew about it. And so we all trekked up there to Crawford, which makes like the fourth time I've been to Crawford. Well, probably sixth time I've been to Crawford in my life. And even though it's just an hour and a half away, and checked out this fiddle contest. And it was pretty interesting. There were fiddlers from all over the Panhandle, from Wyoming, from South Dakota, from Colorado, that came up to and it was the 60th anniversary year this year of this fiddle competition. And apparently people have flown or driven in from in previous years, from Kansas, from Missouri, all over the place. And I was stunned to find this out. I had no idea that, and I love old timey fiddle music. So it was something that to find out that actually existed in my geographic region and had never heard of it. I was sort of stunned. I was really impressed. So there are lots of things, even though I am a nearly lifelong Nebraskan, there are lots of things that I don't know that I need to find out. And now that I am not in school, maybe I can do a little more traveling.
Yeah.
So welcome, Fizz. How's it going? So this is an AMA. We have had a few questions about a couple of things about comic shops, and the rest of them have been random. But that's fine. That's fine. Any of you guys have questions in the chat or things that you want to get off your chest, holler at us. And if it gets boring enough, maybe we'll even drop a link and let people jump on and yell at us in person. Although I don't know that I've done much that deserves yelling at. I don't know. You could tell me.
It's the internet. Yelling is kind of just a standard.
That's true. So speaking of which, here's a story to kill a little time. So did you ever? I don't know if you were ever a part of the CBR forums back in the day when Comic Book Resources was actually worth checking out.
No, I used to be a heavy forum guy, but the last place I wanted to go was argue about comics with people who were too pedantic about them.
Well, in the early aughts, and I'm talking like 2001 through like 5, the CBR forums were pretty legit, and they'd have pros come in, and it wasn't so much arguing about them as like people that were genuinely wanting to talk about comics. There was a little bit of arguing, but so at the time I was working at a call center, and I would check out the forums in between calls. And I was also first getting into working on writing comic scripts, and I had been putting together spec scripts to work to send up to DC and the whole business. Collecting rejection letters, my wife used to call it. And so one of the things that, or did I call it that? And she just made fun of me. I can't remember how that worked out. It's been a long time ago. Forgive me. Anyhow, back then I was following DC's script guidelines, which were all dialogue were to be in capital letters. So I would have my caps lock on whenever I was writing dialogue. So I would go over, I'd be doing that, and then I'd jump onto the forums and try to comment on everything, and it would of course be all caps because that's just how it was. Yeah. And then people in the forums would be like, "Don't be so rude." I was like, "What are you talking about? I have no idea what's going on here. Don't yell. Stop yelling." Oh, sorry, I was writing dialogue for comic book scripts, and for some reason that wasn't a good enough reason.
Yeah. I mean, to this day, caps lock still kind of implies yelling, and people are almost traumatized or triggered if somebody's like all caps in chat.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. It's pretty crazy. Jim S says, "What is the best thing to see in your half of Nebraska from a tourist point of view?" If I was to pick one thing that I would take, that I almost always take the time to go see if I have the time, is Carhenge up in Alliance. I love Carhenge. And I know, for those of you who don't know, Carhenge is a replica of Stonehenge made out of classic cars. It's on the sand. It's buried in the sandhills of West Nebraska.
I
just
didn't
north
know
of
what
the
it
town
was,
of
but
Alliance.
that's what I would have guessed just from the name.
Yeah, fair enough. I absolutely love Carhenge. It's also worth noting that, but yeah, I there's lots of other stuff to see, but I if you're in the neighborhood, don't miss Carhenge. Also, Fort Laramie is pretty awesome. That's technically in Wyoming, but it's only like an hour and 3/4 from here. So, and it's right on the way to Yellowstone if you're in Scottsbluff. So, I check out that. But like, a lot of people look for Chimney Rock because of Oregon Trail. But I think Scottsbluff's actually got better views. So, but yeah, I don't know. Okay. Another thing that if you are cruising through West Nebraska, you've got to drive through what's called Ash Hollow, which is northwest of Lake McConaughey. If you take Highway 26, I think it is, out, it joins off of 30. 30 is the Lincoln Highway that runs from New York all the way to San Francisco, or it used to. Not all of it's available anymore because some of it was dismantled when they built I-80. But if you're driving around Lake McConaughey on 30, and then you exit onto 26, you drive northeast, where it was actually northwest, through Ash Hollow, which is some of the most beautiful area that I've ever seen. Deep hills, huge trees. It's gorgeous. And I'm also, I love being out on the plains, but when you find a little bit of forest in the middle of the plains, it's pretty awesome. So those are some highlights that I would say. But I also might not be the right tourist eye because I'm here most of the time, so I get to see. I like to I get to appreciate some of this stuff multiple times, and in a little more less laid back fashion. So if you're on a rush, don't miss Carhenge. So, why is Wonder Woman completely revamped every decade? Jim Tooner answers, because the creator of Wonder Woman was a true weirdo and nobody can return Wonder Woman to its original ideas. This is 100% fact. And the other part of it is that even though like Wonder Woman's very concept is super deviant, the other aspect of it is that as you write Wonder Woman and you tell the truth, you end up moving away from a feminist paradigm toward a paradigm of true feminine empowerment, which means motherhood and sisterhood and stable relationships and all that kind of stuff that goes into the female heroine's journey of the reestablishing order around the home. And you can't have that. So you have to break up every one of Wonder Woman's relationships and bring chaos back into her life, because you can't let her story resolve itself.
Yeah.
And
she also gets revamped in multiple ways, right? So that's the philosophical storytelling way, which is what drives the story. But then there's also the fact that every single time they try to revamp DC's universe, they also end up changing like the relation of the gods to the universe, which inevitably affects Wonder Woman's stories as well.
Yep. And I think it's always an attempt. I think I think in many ways it's an intentional attempt to preserve the feminist roots of the quote unquote feminist roots of Wonder Woman without understanding the actual nature of how feminism relates to femininity. So, and also
the answer to that is it doesn't.
Yeah, well, that's also true too. But it does relate, but not in a one-to-one sort of way. It's sort of in a
almost in like a like opposite direction. It's trying to capture masculinity in the feminine form instead of femininity.
Yeah. And it gets more and more masculine too. That's the
over
thing
time,
about it. Yeah. And it's also true that Wortham was in fact a bizarre deviant, and Ooh, there's a spicy little take. Here, Wonder Woman's roots are female supremacy, not feminism.
Is there a difference?
And there sort of is,
Mhm.
especially from the Wortham I'm not Wortham. That's the other guy. Oh my goodness, I'm having a total brain fart, and I look like a moron. Come on. Dude invented the lie detector test. I can't remember his name. Marsden. William Marsden. But yeah, from his perspective, which is the idea that it's Burton. Was the idea that happiness through emasculation and female empowerment, and that females would female ruling the world through a feminine lens, excluding it. But I'm trying to even think about how to frame it. Marsden's like fantasies that he put into Wonder Woman. It's basically a dominatrix fantasy, which still titillates the male like sex urges. The Crumb, if you ever read Crumb talk about like his relationship toward muscly girls, it's basically the same kind of thing that Marsden put into Wonder Woman, but it's not necessarily like feminism, like people look at it. But I think those things are intrinsically related because the female supremacy still leads on the idea that power is the defining force of like merit, right? And so you have this idea of the masculine trait that power and competence and dominance are good things, because they're kind of what how guys rank file themselves, right?
Well, this just sounds like it's a perspective thing. Like, is the boot being pressed on you for her pleasure or yours?
Yeah. And I mean, what is the intention and purpose of the boot, right? And not just who's gaining pleasure from it, but also what's the point of it. Because even female supremacy is still, it still has the idea that men aren't worthy and aren't competent. And so it shares driving forces with second wave feminism, particularly. But it's a different perspective on it. Whereas second and third wave feminism was the move toward the idea to become more and more mannish. Female supremacy, it theoretically has a limiting principle, which is that we can't go do man things man ways because man ways are stupid. But if you look at how Paradise Island is set up, it's still the same, many of the same big government fascistic or para-fascistic tendencies that would define and man's world and be scolded at by the very comic that is decrying it, because females are more gentle innately, so their punishment is not going to be as oppressive as male punishment. So
I mean, if they say so.
That's what they say. Well, yeah.
In some ways, the fact that more impressive.
Well, I think it absolutely isn't. I mean, and this is unpopular to say on YouTube, but statistically, lesbian relationships involve the largest amount of domestic violence of any other long-term relationships. So I think that and single mother households involve a significant amount of child abuse, more so than single father households. And there could be lots of reasons for that. But it's still in the statistics. So
I think part of it too is like it is like a power thing, right? Like your dad, if he yelled at you, you're probably going to listen because you know he could hit you, whether he's going to or not, but he could, right? You don't really care if your mom hits you. So then she has to start doing like psychological stuff to you to be able to stay in control, which is probably going to be more abusive long term.
Mom's superpower is the fact that the in a discipline scenario is the fact that you owe your mom your life.
Yeah.
And that she can call dad at any minute. Right? And those are the things.
Well, that's also why like the single mother household has to get more abusive though, because she doesn't have that second one.
Well, I think so. And also the I think there's the anytime we're made to pair up and produce offspring.
Yeah.
And it takes 15 to 20 years for that offspring to get sufficient enough to repeat the cycle. So it's a long term. It's obviously designed to be a long-term investment that requires the equal participation of both parties involved, because none of us are complete. We need each other for the things the others don't have. And anytime you have a situation where you've got two people or you have one person that isn't a complete parental package trying to do all those jobs, they're not going to pull it off unless they bring in reinforcements. I mean, like I had some good friends of mine, and I'm not trying to be judgy for those people that find themselves in situations. My parents split up, so I'm just saying what I've seen. But when I was young and my parents were still together, my best friend, his folks split up when they were very young, and mom went to live with her folks, and so my buddy and his little brother, they got fathered in a parental sense from their grandfather, and they had that close relationship, and he took them out to work on cars and go hunting and all that kind of stuff. So there was still that level of interaction there that they would have got if they weren't living with their grandfolks.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important aspect. It allowed their mom to still be mom and not try to have to fill another role until the time that she ended up remarrying a really great guy, and he picked up where they all left, where father-in-law left off. So it was a good situation.
Yeah, if you don't have that, I think no matter what, no matter like what, doesn't matter which side gets you, whether it's you're with a mom or with a dad, you're suffering some type of neglect.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, and there are times where I think that's the only option. If you've got infidelity or you've got, whatever but it's never the ideal. And it's not always the ideal, even when mom and dad are in the picture, because sometimes people suck. well,
I mean, life's messy. I mean, how close are we
everybody
ever to an
sucks all the time.
Yeah.
Why does Wonder Woman's Rogue Gallery suck so much? I think it is partly because people have a hard time developing a long-term image for what Wonder Woman should be. And because of that, they have a hard time building alternate options against it. I think more recently, a lot of it is because modern writers are afraid of painting the female characters as truly evil to oppose the goodness of Wonder Woman. So you get a lot of tragic figures, not a lot of actually evil, right? And I think that in a World War II context, you had less of that because you could definitely show the Nazis being bad guys.
Yeah.
And a lot of Wonder Woman's foes, there were the super villains that were female, and then the war villains that were male. And so I think you'd have some different interplay. But I think in a modern setting, it's harder to tie those things in together.
Yeah, I think it's another problem too, is they do keep trying to play into the godhood aspect of her. So it's like a lot of her villains have to be gods, or if they weren't already, we're going to make some of her villains gods, which they've evolved into over time too. So it kind of makes some of them more boring than they had to be.
I think there's a lot of laziness that goes into the writing too.
Yeah.
A lot of with Wonder Woman especially. I mean, all superheroes can fall into this, but I think
she
Wonder
gets
Woman
passed around a lot more than the other ones do. That has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, so
Especially
Now,
if you know
Neo
it's like,
had asked,
this is just so I could get on better books. Why am I gonna spend too much effort developing this character?
right? Well, and I think also the fact about what motivates females, what motivates males in a story are different. And I think that becomes a factor in it all too. And also, like when women like really write superhero stories, they're not necessarily writing girl stories.
No,
That's another aspect of it. I mean, the rare exception being, when Gail Simone was first writing Birds of Prey right after Chuck Dixon had left the title. I mean, those were like 2.5 years of super solid bird stories. But they were dealing in a liminal space between like spy stories and superhero stories anyway.
yeah.
And they'd already built a really deep bench for these different types of girl personalities and how they'd interact, and so I think there was a lot of stuff that went into that, and any kind of girl drama was like framing stuff, wasn't part of the actual meat of the stories. Wonder Woman seems to have a really hard time separating personal life from action storytelling. So Neo asked the question, what is a dream crossover between two series or characters you'd love to see happen? Whew. Honestly, and I know it's been done, but I would love to see. So how many of you people are out there familiar with the Green Hornet? Green Hornet was a radio show that was produced in the early 40s that was a sequel to the Lone Ranger. I would love, now there have been a Lone Ranger Green Hornet crossover. But what I would love to see is I would love to see Ron Fortier, the guy who brought the Green Hornet back into the modern eye in the 90s, by taking the Green Hornet stories from the radio and from the TV show and making a legacy character through the generation of the 20th century. And it was awesome. And I would love for him to take a crack at a Green Hornet story in a Lone Ranger Green Hornet crossover taking place like with two stories that have shared elements, and that's his take on it all, because I'd love to see his vision on it. He is not particularly interested in that.
Yeah. Like, it would be really cool if it was like in the same place. So like the actions of the Lone Ranger ended up affecting the crime that's happening in the Green Hornet later on. Exactly.
But part of it is what he did with continuity was so tight. And I came across it when I first got into comics back in 91. So 1991. So I would love to see his take on those perspectives. Some of the other writers that have come afterwards have done decent stuff for Dynamite and things like that too. But I still would just absolutely love to see Ron's take on it. But I'm sure that was never going to happen.
As long as Seth Rogen has nothing to do with it, I'm fine.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Matt Wagner even did a run on Green Hornet stuff for Dynamite, and I read a couple of issues of that that were not bad at all. So, but
actually, bringing that up too, on some levels, I actually liked the Green Hornet movie. I just wish it wasn't called Green Hornet because it felt like a parody of the Green Hornet, even though it hit a lot of the same beats in some ways. I wish it just was like some other named thing that was trying to parody Green Hornet. Yeah, and I probably would have enjoyed it more.
The dude they had playing Kato was legit. I don't even know the guy's name, but he was
Seth's side that was just dragging everything down.
Yeah, it was.
But it would have been funny also if it was just a parody instead.
I also didn't care for the fact that like it was like a new invention, right?
Yeah.
Like they discovered the Black Beauty and like, oh, it's just his dad because he's weird and paranoid and I hate my father. And it was like, if he had discovered that his dad had been the Green Hornet
and he took it on, and then you wouldn't care if he was a legacy that was dumb. Right.
Right. Then because he can grow up and not be dumb because you've got this weight of everything.
I do feel like that was dropped Like that was handled almost better in Looney Tunes Back in Action. Funny enough. Right, because his dad was the spy, and then he had to go and save his spy dad using his dad's spy stuff.
Oh my gosh, that's funny. Yeah. Anyway, yeah. So, yeah, that's a crossover I would like to see. I also, I would love to see, and this will never happen either, but I would love to see a crossover between My Gal the Zombie by Dan Connor and the Addams Family. So all my gal stuff is up out of reach. I can't bring it down to show y'all, but Dan Connor, friend of mine, did a series called My Gal the Zombie about a gal who gets infected by a zombie virus and just wants to live her life as a young woman in college. And it's kind of in the vein of Archie stuff, where it's got this kind of always in the now and generally wholesome with some action stuff that's part of it, and stuff. I just absolutely love it. I think it's super adorable, and I would love to see a crossover with the Addams Family and My Gal the Zombie. So there you go. I'll give you those two. How about you, Metal? Is there any crossovers you would love to see?
Crossovers I would love to see. I don't know. Sometimes, like it's fun to see crossovers, but also I kind of like to have most of my food on the different parts of the tray where they don't mix.
You like the separated plates.
Yeah, it's like I kind of like things to exist in their own worlds and stuff. I don't need things to cross over. But if I did, I think probably one that would be really cool, because of like maybe the video game-ness of the history of one, is I'd like to see Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in their most wacky version crossover with Scott Pilgrim. I think that would be a pretty fun little event to happen.
That's hilarious. So so here's a side note. I was listening to Chuck Dixon's stream from earlier today, and his Ask Chuck Dixon, and they were saying, he was telling a story about when he was a kid, he never understood. Somebody asked him about never understanding people being Marvel people versus DC people, and Chuck's like, I totally agree with this, la da da da. And I'll tell you why I was a DC guy, right? I was a DC guy because I dug Batman and I wanted to see more of his world, right? I love the universe storytelling. And I was less interested in Marvel when I first got into comics because nothing that would happen in Spider-Man was ever going to affect what would happen in Batman. But when I was reading about Batman and I read about Commissioner Gordon's heart attack, that had an impact in the brand new Robin series that was coming out, and it had an impact in, Detective Comics, right? And so because I almost instantly got invested into the universe of DC. I love the Green Hornet too, and I knew it wasn't connected, and that was okay with me, sort of, kind of. But but I was a DC guy because I would love the universe that it happened in. So when it comes to crossovers, I'm always thinking about how is this thing gonna build the lore, right? That's the thing that I'm really interested in is how is this going to build the lore? So like, I really enjoyed Batman Daredevil, right? But like that doesn't really build the lore at all. It just makes me interested about Daredevil stories separately, right?
Yeah.
Batman Spawn was a cool story, but it didn't really mesh together super well because the premises of the universes are so disparate, right?
So we need a crossover between the Tick and Earthworm Jim.
That would work. That could work really well. Not only is it thematically similar, there's nothing about the Tick that would preclude the space weirdness of Earthworm Jim. So that would be a thing. but I think it's got to be something that would necessarily build the lore. Like, okay, for example, the TMNT Batman crossover was fun, right? But there's no way the world of TMNT belongs in the DC universe.
Nope.
It just doesn't fit. So even though I liked seeing those characters interact, I totally forget about it. So like, it doesn't feed my lore bug at all. And
well, I think that was even the thing too. Was like it doesn't fit. So like everything happened in the TMNT world, right? Like they were over there, and there was like the Shredder, and like it wasn't in Gotham; it was in New York or whatever.
Yeah. So that was so those are the kind of things where like I feel like it's got to be a good fit. And that's like one thing, like Batman, Hellboy, Starman. Hellboy could be part of the DC universe. So,
Yeah.
Like that one I really enjoyed because it felt like it could be part of it. Like I could absolutely see a world where, you've got Alan Scott and you've got Ted Knight and you've got, Jay Garrick. They're having all of these World War II adventures. Meanwhile, the government has a secret base while they're doing all this crazy demon stuff that the All-Star Squadron has no idea about, right? That totally I could totally believe that. So,
Jim, that's just the beginning of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
yeah. That's literally the beginning of that is in fact.
It would be fun is somehow, because Marvel owns the rights to half of this, right? Would be Hellboy Men in Black crossover, where the entire time they're trying to like complain whether it's an alien or a demon that they're hunting.
That would be amazing. Well, and it would be I would love to see that, just because, like, especially the first beginning of it, where Jay Will Smith's out there and he's just like, he thinks it's an alien, he thinks he's got this taken care of, and then like, this demon just like inhabits the body of whatever else it is, and totally is out of his league, and you get to see Will Smith be just absolutely a goofball until Hellboy just comes up and like throws a rosary around its neck and chokes.
They're like arguing about jurisdiction. It's like, well, the demon's not from this planet, so it's an alien.
Yeah, that would be a real ugly fight. Hellboy would absolutely not have the patience for Jay.
It would, the more I think about it, the better this crossover sounds.
There you go. So Fizz says the Turtles are underpowered for the DC universe. I think that's possibly true. The nice thing I like about the DC universe is that because it's so vast, because there's so much going on, not every pocket has to fit every other pocket. So like John Constantine and Zatanna don't ever have to actually meet. So you've got this light side of magic and this, grim, dirty, backroom bar sort of magic, and they don't have to have anything to do with each other. Hiroshi says the kind of crossovers I liked were the mid-90s proto meme Mr. T versus websites. I don't think I've seen those, but if you're interested in Mr. T content, you might want to go check out Forces of Good and Evil. Just saying, he may or may not show up from time to time there in rural Wisconsin. You never know.
Those were always the crossovers I liked, though, is when you involved basically like real life people or the characters they portrayed and put them in there. Because like if someone like Mr. T showed up in, I don't know, Marvel, you wouldn't care because you're like, well, there's probably has to be a version of Mr. T that exists because Marvel is just our world plus all of these superheroes and whatever else they added. So like that stuff I never mind if like you just want to have like a guest come in like, oh, his agent or whatever is working with you to make sure his likeness is correct or whatever.
Yeah, and the Mr. T was in several comic books. In fact, I'm pretty pleased to say I believe I have all but one comic appearance of Mr. T. I have a complete Mr. T. I think a nearly complete Mr. T collection. There's one volume that may or may not exist. There is some conflicting information about, but I believe I've tracked down every comic appearance of Mr. T. So But yeah, I love Mr. T. I grew up with Mr. T. I was going to be Mr. T for Halloween one year, but got really depressed when I found out blackface wasn't cool, and my mom wouldn't apply the makeup to make me look like Mr. T.
Yeah.
And she wouldn't cut my hair into a mohawk. So 7-year-old Rhys was super, maybe even 6. I may have been 6. It was real sad that I couldn't be Mr. T.
That's funny too, but also what Jim said.
Blankets meets Mr. T in rural Wisconsin. Oh my god. Oh, what do you mean you don't love Jesus? I I pity the fool. I pity the fool that doesn't love Jesus. That's amazing. You think male writers' horniness makes heroines suffer? Sometimes.
Depends on the writer. Like
It depends on the writer.
I don't know if they have no self-control, if they're immature, of course it's going to.
Well, and I mean, like, and I mean, okay, and here's part of it, right? If you're an honest writer of hero fiction, you make your heroes suffer.
Yeah.
Right? That's that you have to give them adversity to overcome.
This is not the type of suffering I think we're talking about, though.
Okay.
The characterization suffer.
Yeah.
And it can.
Yeah. Well, I think so. Okay, so here's a really good example. Maybe. Did anybody else read? I only read the first issue of Cat Lath's Hellcat comic.
No.
Okay, so Patsy Walker Hellcat. Patsy Walker started as a Marvel romance title before the Marvel universe existed, right?
Yeah.
She had her series, and it was a teen romance comic, and it faded away. And then Stan brought her into Iron Man as a supporting character, where she had, married her high school boyfriend, who was the regular fellow in the Patsy Walker story, and her marriage ended up falling apart, and she ended up being a secretary for Stark, and then dying, and then going to hell, and then fighting her way out of hell after she fell in love with the devil's son. What was his name? Hellstrom, Damian Hellstrom, who was the hero Hellstorm. And that's why she became this superhero Hellcat, because she had devil powers, because she got herself out of hell. Or Damon Hellstrom. Thank you, Jim. So, and she'd been in and out of stuff. The Devil Jr.
I like that name better.
That's amazing. And so she'd been a side character in and out, and she'd been in the Avengers and whatever else, and she'd been totally forgotten about forever. And Kate Leth brought her back in Patsy Walker Hellcat. And I only read the first issue. And I was going to write an essay on it for the website, and I couldn't figure out. Well, hello, Ray. Thank you for stopping by, and God bless you as well. I couldn't figure out how I wanted to write it, because one of the things that they did was that they took Patsy's first ex-husband, because she and the devil ended up getting a divorce or something. She'd been like 2 or 3 times divorced. And Patsy Walker Hellcat was basically a teen romance book cosplaying as a superhero book, right? So Patsy goes to work as a private detective under the employ of She-Hulk in She-Hulk's law business, right? But she also has all this other day in the life kind of stuff. And it's kind of a setup where it's not a proper superhero book, but that doesn't necessarily mean it would be bad. But everybody in this comic, at least the first issue, was so thirsty that it was like like anything that the book had to offer got sidetracked because everyone was so thirsty. Patsy was thirsty. Her ex-husband, who decided he was gay, but they were still best friends, was super thirsty. Patsy's friends were super thirsty. She-Hulk, who's on 2 pages, was super thirsty. It's just like, oh my God, am I reading Friends here without the good jokes? And then the jokes they had were in
Good
it were
jokes.
just like it was terrible. It wasn't a good book.
Yeah.
And it had a lot of material that could have been something, but it was just so thirsty. I mean, it's like every other comment was some sort of like horny comment, and it was one of those things where you talk about the writer's horniness wrecking the book. Well, yeah. that seems to be a real thing in this case.
Well,
because,
so Eva says, do you think male writers, actually, judging by the type of stories that female writers write, right, even in case, I think female writers' horniness can suffer the writing more than a male writer half the time.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, if you're talking about, like, you know, the male horniness, putting characters in peril and all that kind of stuff. I mean, okay, tons of 1980s and 90s books had situations where they took their female characters into ridiculous situations, and you know, things just bordering on Cinemax kind of content. I mean, barbed wire, that was in that thing entire premise was that kind of thing. But it you know, I don't know. That was sort of the soup in which they existed. It didn't necessarily keep the characters from doing what the characters. Well, I mean, the barbed wire was designed as to be a thirst trap. So I mean, that's that kind of thing. It sort of fits into it. But the Patsy Walker Hellcat book, and I mean, even like the Mockingbird book that was out there that, you know, asked me about my, you know, feminist agenda kind of stuff. A lot of them have the material of really good stories in there and genre crossing stuff, but it was one of the things where they wouldn't they won't commit to any real growth of the characters, and the stakes and the thirst are so high that they become they hold the book down. Okay, so here's a good example of something that isn't that still fits into that genre, right? Betty and Veronica. Right? Archie comics. Those girls are both little thirsty, right? But not so much that they don't get along, not so much that they don't still have their silly adventures, not so much that it like becomes the predominant aspect about their thing. You know, Betty wants to hang out with Archie, and Archie's too busy with Jughead. So Betty goes over to Veronica's house, and then they, you know, hop a plane and then go surfing or whatever it is. I mean, you know, it's not my thing, but the fact that you know, the romance bug and that impulse is part of their story, but it doesn't define their entire journey on all that. And I think that's probably one of the elements that you have is in Hellcat and in some of those other books, though it becomes such a predominant thing that it becomes such a predominant thing that it overwhelms all their other themes in the book. And I think that's one aspect about that. I want to go back up here because I missed a question earlier from Fly Fox, so I don't know if he's still here or not. But what age range appropriate for the Bad Guys book Behind Your Bed? I bought it for the little guys, but I haven't checked it out yet myself. I love Bad Guys. It is probably reading level like 5 to 9. It's not a beginning reader, but it's not super complicated. The worst thing in it are fart jokes. As far as that kind of stuff, I think it's probably pretty appropriate for your guys are real small, right? They're like 5 and 3. If I remember
Might
right,
be appropriate to be read too.
Yeah. But I think the Bad Guys is pretty good. So Jim comments, in the 70s, Marvel had an extended family able 10 devil characters, which is true. There's so much devil going on in the 70s in Marvel.
So we need a handsome, charismatic character who's kind of a little bit of trickster, right? So that his superheroics are trickster, and he's a half demon. So the comics book's name is Devil-Ish.
Well, I've got Demon Priest.
Yeah. Well, you put Demon Priest in a book called Devil-Ish, it could still work.
That would actually work really well, especially because like the long-term arc of Demon Priest is like suburban family man, who's also a half demon. So, good little spoiler alert there, guys.
He's both devilish and devil-ish.
Yes, yeah. Chris Claremont back in the 80s and 90s, probably the best stuff with female characters. I think there's a lot of that. I will also point to Chuck Dixon's stuff on Birds, which is one of the first comics that I specifically noticed girls talking like girls. So, real question, why do female solo heroes not work in superhero comics? I think they do. I think they can.
Yeah, do they not? Since when?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it all depends on who's actually doing the writing and if they're serious about girls and heroes, right? That's the level at which you have to have. You have to writing girl heroes is almost like writing cross-genre fiction, right? Cross-genre fiction has to complete all of the aspects of each genre you're working at, right? So that's one of the problems with Tom King's work on Batman, was he wanted to write a Batman story that was also a romance story, right?
Yeah.
But he sacrificed the Batman character and Batman stories for the sake of the romance story. So you end up with a sullen, depressed, impotent, feckless chump of a Batman instead of a Batman who is complementing his life through a relationship. Batman's not going to enter into a romance if it's not going to help him. He's got enough.
Mask of the Phantasm is such a good movie,
right? And Batman's got enough detachment, rational detachment, that he's not going to let himself be pushed around like that. So the thing is, you have to have, in order to tell female solo heroes, you have to have a story that is that qualifies, that is doing all the things a girl story has to do, but is also telling all the things a superhero story has to do.
Yeah. That's why Supergirl has tons of really good solo runs. That's actually probably one of my favorite DC characters. I love reading Supergirl
the
books.
Peter David run
up until recently.
The Peter David run, for example, is perfect in that. But also other female superheroes that
I also used to really like Carol Danvers before she became Captain Marvel. I used to have a lot of really good solo runs,
Yeah, I think a lot of good solo stuff with that. But the thing I think you're looking at, that one thing comes to that though, is that Danvers didn't have she had a lot of solo stories, but didn't have a lot of runs. She just wasn't given a lot of space before the change. And I think even Captain Marvel is an appropriate name for the character, but they hollowed out the character and took a lot of
I guess I wouldn't even ever call it runs. They were almost always like limited series or like an event or something going on.
That's fair. Yeah. But another example of female heroes that are done right would be, let me think here. Speaking of Supergirl, Twitless's Adventures of Omega Girl, all solo girl stuff. And Omega Girl is written, and not just because he's a pal, but he legitimately writes a character who is a girl, but is doing genuinely heroic things. And that's really solid. I think that's really good. I was talking about My Gal the Zombie earlier. It's very cross genre. There's slice of life stuff, there's straight comedy stuff, but there are hero stories that are part of that. And they anchor onto how is Chelsea, the zombie girl, relating to these situations around her, and saving people that are involved and sometimes being saved, and I think that works out really well that way. So I think it has to do with being true to how girls act in relationships, and that's a big part of it because girls' stories are relationship stories. So
Yeah, there's another good one. We jump over to the other side of the sea. There's the classic manga Birdie the Mighty, which is a superhero story that is a. I mean, there's like an agent guy that does stuff with her because they're technically working for the government as like secret agents, but she is super powerful and is a solo super character. So
yeah, well, I think even the in Spy X Family, the Your segments,
yeah,
are very much Yours segments. They
Yeah.
relate to her relationships and the relationships that she wants to have versus one she really has, all that kind of stuff. But they're still very much her parts of that story. I also, on to Jim's comment, I do believe that is true. If for no other reason, then that's exactly what happened with with
yeah. I don't know what's up with him because King has the
Well, I'm trying to
capacity to
remember
write good stories. He just chooses not to.
I'm trying to remember the character's name. The human target, Chance. Why am I blanking out on stuff today, dude?
No, I don't know.
I don't know. Anyway,
I'm kind of already spent. I streamed for several hours earlier. And I was like, I could do it. We're just doing like an AMA today. I don't have to.
I don't have to think about it. So, Christopher Chance. Oh, and Guy Gardner in the same book. That was ridiculous. Also, it's the way that with Adam Strange, it's all the same, like, sad sack, weak sauce stuff. And the thing about it is that like masculinity doesn't mean you're always strong. Being confident doesn't mean you're always right. It means that you're going to be able to figure it out when you're not, and make it right when you do wrong. That's what confidence means. That's what masculinity is. Real, honest masculinity. And that's one of the things that's so frustrating is that King's writing is full of so much uncertainty that it's like, that it makes all of his characters seem weak. And I think it would make sense if I think that can be a good story of growth for somebody. I mean, like you look at like Night Owl in Watchmen, is the story of how what's his name gets his groove back, right? But that's because that's an intermediary place. There's a growth that happens through that. And that's it. And even with Jim saying there's always a stand-in for Tom King's all-knowing wife, I don't necessarily think that's necessarily a bad thing if it wasn't that he has to bring every character through the same arc of uncertainty to end to a place of placid, semi-competence, instead of having somebody rise and actually, I mean, the counterpoint, and I don't know how many of you guys have gotten out there and read Doug TenNapel's Earthboy Jacobus. But like the story that Doug takes the old cop through is exactly the kind of journey you want to see a guy go through, because it's going from one kind of competence and then in it discovering a weakness to developing another level of competence and in it discovering its weaknesses, and it's a growth that happens progressively, and it's going through on the old cop and also on Jacobus the kid. And so you have these progressive plateaus of understanding and development that happen through the course of the book. And it's not like it's a heavy philosophical treatise on the nature of heroism. It's just a part of the space opera. But it still works into that. So it in each phase of the story, you feel like you're learning something new. It's awesome. I love Jacobus.
Speaking of like all-knowing wife quote, a thing I would like to see more of, and maybe I'll do it in a story sometime because I'd like to see more of, is I'd like if somebody wants to have like a healthy relationship with a superhero and a spouse in a good position, is they should kind of like pull the Columbo. And they should just put the wife in like the Alfred position for Batman, where like she's just there at the cave, right? And if he does, like, he's stumped on something, maybe he can go back and bounce ideas off like Columbo does when he calls his wife up or whatever.
That was exactly the dynamic between Nick and Nora Charles in The Thin Man, but also between Ralph and Sue Dibney in the Elongated Man stories, where Ralph is the goofball, but he's also this brilliant investigator, and his wife is just this rock, this gorgeous, fun-loving, but sober-minded rock, and it was this great dynamic, and everybody who wrote them was just nearly everyone who wrote them had this brilliant dynamic between them, and it was this nature that, I mean, this within their natures that played out this complete human experience, where and the other thing that was great about it was how much joy Sue took in Ralph's love of mysteries. And so there's one of the premises in the story is that every year for their anniversary, Sue would plan this elaborate mystery, and it would be like a scavenger hunt. And so Ralph goes gallivanting on one of them in one of the Detective Comics annuals. Goes on this like gallivanting, like this around the world, like, mystery story where it's clue to clue to clue. We are going through wherever, and it's all to get their anniversary present, and he doesn't even know it. It was brilliant. It was great. But to have the fact that these characters relish in what makes them unique and complementary to each other in a way that's just a celebration of couplehood. It's remarkable. So the fact that more like that, the fact that there are writers who take a look at marriage in comics and say, nope, can't do that, when you've got examples of that same kind of or similar kinds of dynamics in Peter and Mary Jane, in Ralph and Sue, in Wally and Linda, in flipping even Clark and Lois, right? Where they have these different personalities that are designed to be complementary and celebratory, and we get to see them played out through difficult times and in hard times. And yet you have people that have been like, oh, it's not interesting. We need to make sure that our heroes stay sad and alone and living in the big city and not being able to pay rent. And it's like,
yeah, I mean, you could even do it like the other way around too, right? As long as it's a healthy, like you could have the woman be like the go-getter. Maybe the guy just has had a stable job for a while and he's at home while she's off doing heroics. And that was, every so often she just needs a grounded thing to bounce off of,
Well, that was basically the dynamic in The Silencer.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I don't know if you read The Silencer or not, but
I have not read it, but I've seen a lot from it.
Oh, it's so good.
Yeah.
It's so good. It's criminal that that the character wasn't used after the series. But basically, this gal is a retired hitman and metahuman hitman, and she just wants to have a normal life. And so she marries this dude who's and people at first couple issues were like, well, he seems kind of weak. Well, he's just a normal guy. He's got nothing fancy about him. He goes jogging in the mornings. He goes sells houses. He's got they've got a kid. It's a normal, boring suburban life. And then she gets snatched up and blackmailed by Talia al Ghul to go back to the killing people business. And then you get to see her husband, who's like, where did my wife go? And basically, I mean, and I don't think in the whole course of the story he discovers the backstory of any of it, but unless it's the last issue, I just don't remember because it's been a while since I read it all. But he turns into this baby saving action hero because of the stuff that's going on, and he's like, and in his mind he's like, I'll save my wife from whatever, and he's 100% outclassed. But
it's the spirit that matters.
Yeah, because she's there's metahuman and cyborg assassins that are around the corner, and then he doesn't know that, of course. He's got it because he doesn't have any context for what his wife did in her previous life, but it was it was a great thing, and and they really could have done something with that, and still kept, an honor to those gender roles, given the fact they've got this extraordinary life, and that's the life women like who are EMTs live, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's tons of women that are EMTs or emergency room nurses, or couple of women that are successful firefighters. The like 3 out of 1,000 that are tough enough to get through the regs. But I mean that's
I actually happen to know one of those.
What?
Like personally, I happen to know a woman that falls into that personally.
Yeah.
And,
No, those
grew up with her. She went
those.
to the same church as me.
Yeah, I wouldn't. You don't want to take anything away from those people. They are tough.
Yeah.
If you're a girl and you could pass those, I couldn't pass those tests, those phys tests. Forget it. If you're a chick that can pull that off, you are a stick of dynamite. So, yeah. But yeah, I mean, like I said, those women that are in those high action, high intensity careers, a lot of, I mean, they do live a life where they have a stable, boring guy back home, and that's okay.
That's what you want at that point. You're like, like he's here. Maybe he's accountant, writer, something, but it's just like he's always there. You know, helps ground you when you get home.
So, Fizz says that's what he has for one of his characters. I'm assuming he's talking about the supportive, all-knowing Alfred type wife, because that's what I think we were talking about at the time. This is an awesome comment. I think it took Adam Strange's Tom King calling himself out as a war criminal. Well, he was in the CIA. Okay.
Well, I think his war crimes are all related to writing comics.
You don't think they had to do with disposing of Iraqi yellow cake?
I don't think anything he did there is as bad as what he's done in comics.
I wish I read more Elongated Man stories. I read a few in the Flash, but only a few Ralph and Sue adventures. He was the regular backup in Detective Comics in the late 70s, early 80s as well. So I would recommend looking at some of those if you want. And it would have been awesome to have seen a Ralph and Sue a Hanna-Barbera Ralph and Sue cartoon. Talking about crossovers earlier, I had been working on a pitch for DC years ago that was basically a 6-issue team up miniseries between Plastic Man and Elongated Man. That was like a buddy cop mystery adventure in the vein of like Clue, with a zany level of hijinks. Somebody the other day, I think it was Doug Ernst, was saying that it is a disservice to label a superhero story as wacky, and I keep thinking back to Ambush Bug and thinking I might disagree with Doug on this. I think it depends on the superhero.
There are definitely plenty that are wacky.
Yeah, well, one of my favorite series was Young Justice in the early days, and man, I tell you what they did. They did a perfect balance of wacky teeny bopper humor with serious superhero action, and I think it can be done. It's just a matter of do the characters lend themselves toward that. Like that's one of the problems I had with Gail Simone's Plastic Man mini from a few years ago, was that she tried making Plastic Man wacky instead of realizing that Plastic Man is the straight man.
Yeah.
And everything else is wacky, which is something that Kyle Baker had figured out with his series. And that even Plastic Man's wackiness is it's in his actions, not in his demeanor. So
we were talking about a great wacky superhero comic. You just look at the Great Lake Avengers. That whole thing, it was a whole joke. Like, people died, they lost a member like every single time until Squirrel Girl came around. Like the whole thing was just joke after joke.
Yeah, and I think I had a hard time getting into Great Lakes Adventures. I'll be honest. I felt that was And maybe I just felt like the jokes weren't landing for me, but I definitely think there's a
You
place
should go back
for,
and revisit them.
Maybe I should.
Yeah, because I think they're pretty good. I even like the original version of Squirrel Girl. Like I think she was a fun character. It's later things that ruined her.
Oh, this is fun. Elongated Man Hanna-Barbera cartoon. Imagine it animated with the body being a static long shape and the repeated background scrolling to animate his stretching. Yeah. That would be awesome. Well, and an important difference between Plastic Man and Elongated Man is that Plastic Man can shapeshift and change his actual form, and he doesn't have like an internal like organ structure, right? He's just plastic, right? He can extrude himself to whatever. But Ralph Dibny, his bones stretch and his blood vessels stretch, so he can only be so long before his heart can't get blood to his extremities and he passes out. So that would be an interesting way to kind of show some of that stuff. Plastic Man can open up a hole in the middle of him if he gets shot, like Silly Putty Man.
Yeah.
But Ralph cannot. If you prick him, he will bleed.
Plastic Man just chops off one of his fingers, throws it, and explodes. It's like, I never told you what type of plastic I was made of.
Yeah. There was a Firestorm villain called Plastique.
Yeah.
Was a girl who could do very similar things. Thank you for answering my question. Sorry it took me forever to get to it, man. But yeah, Fizz has a question.
I've got an answer for that.
Yeah, go for it, man.
Right. My answer is that they see Superman as God, and they feel that God has let them down somewhere along the way. That's my real answer for that. They might have other reasons, but if you were to crack down the psychology, I think that's the reason.
Either as God or America or some combination of both.
Or so, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's exactly true. And I think it's because people are continually grasping at 1986, right? At Watchmen, at Dark Knight Returns, and instead of understanding that those projects were there to reflect upon, the importance of true heroism, because that's really what is at the core of both of those stories.
Yeah.
Instead of understanding that, and I think that's a big part of Dark Knight Returns, but it's also the idea of that to do is better than not to do, right? And that I think that the world is more complex than we want it to be. But like that's one of those things that still with the and Frank Miller has had an obsession with moral ambiguity for years. But anyway, back to what I'm saying though, is I think that people take a look at this and this became the highlight of comics, and so what can we do to catch that fire? And missing the point entirely. So I think if the idea is if I can corrupt Superman, then I have the ultimate power.
Yeah.
A narrative sense, and a couple of Superman stories that did that, okay, exist out there in the world, right? So, I think that's part of it. So, there's also the idea of the terror, of the idea of somebody as powerful as Superman becoming a villain. There's an intrinsic terror that's part of that, and so, if you can defeat this ultimate evil, how tough are you? It's like the when people took a look at one joke story and said, "Oh, look, Squirrel Girl can defeat Galactus," right?
Yeah.
And said, "Okay, let's make that the benchmark." Well, suddenly, if you can defeat, evil Superman with a hug, certainly you have the most noble character in existence. So, I think there's also
that's
some
actually what I hated. That direction with Squirrel Girl too. Be like, if she could beat anyone, nobody cares because she's a joke character, right? Like everything about it's a joke. But then when you start bringing that in line with other characters, you even kind of just ruin the joke.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's the same way where, like, if you take Superman and you make him evil, then you've kind of ruined the because, I mean, then he's no longer the Superman, right? He's simply, like anyone else would be if they were all powerful. So I think another part of the motivating factor with it is the idea of, kill the past, let the past die, kill it if you have to. If we're creating the next new thing, then obviously we have to prove ourselves better than the old thing. So Fizz says the gimmick of Superman is more powerful than everyone else, so he has to be a villain for dramatic reasons. And I think that's why Darkseid exists too. In the DC universe, I always thought the introduction of Darkseid into the DC universe was a narrative mistake. And I'm not trying to dismiss the quality of the stories or of the imagining of Jack Kirby. I'm not trying to paint that tree. I'm just saying I don't think it makes sense within that universe to have an anti-god be
I do think more than just an anti-god, right? Because in some ways he really is when you think about what he is. Having something where everything else that is devoid or emptiness is just a shadow of him kind of ruins a lot of things.
And I think it allows it's a way of diluting the evil within men to paint this great evil that's out there in the stars somewhere. And I think that also weakens the narrative core of the DC universe.
Well, I think just deciding to make everything platonic, right? Because like the whole DC universe shape looks like Plato's universe, like the way that he draws the outer rings and stuff, and making all the gods basically platonic. So everything inside the worlds every facet, every interaction is just a shadow of their conflicts. Kind of waters down a lot of what happens in DC, makes it less interesting.
Yeah, I think so. Fizz goes on in these deconstruction stories. I think that's why Omni-Man is the main antagonist. He's the most powerful and therefore evil. Yeah, I agree.
But he also isn't. But that's spoilers to go further on to find out.
Yeah. Well, I mean that's it's complicated in Invincible, but
because his actually ultimately isn't a deconstruction of Superman. And I think that's what a lot of people's interpretation of it is wrong. It's not like where The Boys is very much a deconstruction of Superman. Because in some ways, instead of being a deconstruction of Superman, it's kind of a reconstruction of Spider-Man in a way, just giving him more Superman powers because everything's actually focused more on Mark than Nolan.
Yeah. That's fair. Hiroshi says, I think people just like waiting in miserable stories. There is an appeal for people when they start reaching a certain sophistication. Not maturity, but a certain sophistication where you start to be able to appreciate bad endings. Right? Or stories that can't resolve. When you're young, you're idealistic, you feel the stories have to resolve. And when you reach a certain level of sophistication, it becomes very appealing to see stories where the characters don't resolve. Postman Always Rings Twice, Chinatown, right? The 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Yeah.
Really, almost anything Kubrick did. Kubrick was not a big fan of resolution. But there's a satisfaction. You can learn to appreciate stories that don't resolve because life doesn't necessarily resolve.
Yeah.
Right. So you have you're young, Yeah, you find out your girlfriend cheated on you. You leave with all your stuff. You never hear from her again. There's no resolution to that story, right? You may 15, 20 years later, you may run into her at the Kroger's and she'll mention she's got a couple of kids or whatever, but like that's still not the end of the story, right?
It's really hard to do that well. Like I think one of the few exceptions I can think of is Chasing Amy.
Mm-hmm. Well, Chasing Amy even has some resolution to it.
It's a partial resolution, but it's left open, especially with the ending on purpose, right? That it is supposed to be a story that doesn't fully resolve.
All right. In any case, there's a certain level of sophistication and story appreciation where you learn to appreciate the lack of resolution in the story. But that's like a sophomore understanding of story, right?
Yeah.
Because those stories have a utility, and you let your mind think through things like that. But they're not the whole experience of what it means to appreciate storytelling. I think you need to come back to the childhood understanding of storytelling, understanding why resolution is important, not just that you want to feel it's important, but why it's really important. Right. To be able to appreciate why those narratives speak to our hearts, not just to appreciate them in terms of a consumer, but actually to allow the narratives to shape your thinking. And I think being comfortable with with a lack of resolution is a part of that process, because in some ways it allows your brain to actually think through resolution, right? And to do it.
Yeah. Well, now I'm just thinking about how Jay and Silent Bob actually ruined the partial resolution of Chasing Amy. Like that strikes back because it brings the character back, and that's the problem with shared universes. Sometimes is if you want to leave something partially resolved, the shared universe sometimes ruins it. But
yeah. Well,
I've come up with another name for it, right? So the traditional types of stories, right? We had plot resolution. You had either a comedy, which is when your protagonist lives through the end. You had a tragedy where your protagonist ends at the end. So if it doesn't resolve, it's a misery.
So, here's my first exposure in life to the concept of stories not resolving was, or not resolving to my preconceptions, was the story of the Ruskies, right? And I don't know if you're familiar with Ruskies, but it was a 1980s picture, middle of the Cold War, and there is a Russian sub that gets stuck. Like it gets lost and it gets stuck on like the beach, right? Or gets stuck on a reef. And so they send out one Russian soldier to go to the mainland. And he ends up being discovered by his group of teenage boys. And there's this conflict. Everyone's like, whatever, it's a big freak out. And then they end up befriending this guy despite the language barrier. And meanwhile, the Russians have contacted their authorities, who contact the State Department, who send a thing over, and they end up getting some help and getting the sub, avoiding international incident. And meanwhile, the boys are trying to hide their Russian buddy and whatever else. And the dude falls in love with America, right? Because it's America. But eventually the Russians get back in touch with them, and they think it's going to be a big deal. But the Russian soldier, sailor, whatever, has to go back with the Russians to Russia. And then there's this sad moment at the end of the story, because it's American kids. They're losing their buddy, right? And the buddy loves America, and he belongs here because he loves here, right? Because he's an American. He just wasn't born here. in his spirit, he's discovered he's an American. And so he and so they have this sad leaving, and the kids go back to their families, and the Russians go back to Russia. And I watched this movie, and I could not go to sleep. It was on TV, the Late Show or whatever, and watched it with my fam. And I get up and I'm just like upset, and I'm wandering around the kitchen, and my mom says, "Are you okay?" And I said, it's stupid, but I can't sleep because I keep thinking about this movie and how it had a terrible ending. And so I explained the whole thing, and she says, well, what else would you expect to happen, right? I mean, the dude's contracted with the Russian Navy. He's got to go back.
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, but it's so unsatisfying because clearly he doesn't, if you're an American, you belong in America. If you love this country, you belong here. That's the whole point of that. And so she says, well, just imagine what happens next. Figure out what happens next.
Yeah.
And so I was like,
or you could see it as a tragedy, right? And you could say that on like a emotional or psychological level, they killed an American.
You're right. Yeah. So that was one of those little things where like that was my first exposure to this idea that like sometimes good stories have bad endings and like that's okay. And I was like 12, so I had never even begun to process the concept of tragedy because like except for Shakespeare, we're pretty much not even like introduced to the idea of that, right? But yeah, that was one of those things where like the idea that stories don't resolve in a satisfactory way. I think a lot of ways, like I said, it's a sophomore understanding of storytelling, but it's there to help us to understand this didn't happen because what should have happened, right?
Yeah.
So Macbeth ends the way it did, and you see, okay, so it's pride and ambition and greed that put them in this situation. Romeo and Juliet ends with everyone's death because everyone was stupid. Like everyone,
yeah.
Like Romeo and Juliet were the dumbest people ever. And Rhys went and wrote his Ruskies fan fiction. Sort of. It was all in my mind. I never wrote it down.
I think I was primed for those type of results though, just because like some of the earliest stories that I really got into were myths, and like every hero myth is ultimately a tragedy. They're just optimistic tragedies because they teach things. And it's like, okay, I'm just used to people dying at the end of things, or sometimes the very end seems anticlimactic or a sour note, but that's kind of the point to the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's probably a factor. I spent a lot more time engaging in like Disney movies and cartoons and stuff. So like the idea that ultimate resolution eventually happens, and even going through like Bible stories and church stories, they're placed. Bible stories are placed in this grand opera, right? That encompasses time. So even though we see that people die unjustly and incompletely here, this is not the end of the story. But in a narrative frame,
it's optimism, basically supplanting tragedy every single time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yep. So even the tragedies of this world, it's not the end of the story. So like this world definitely is tragic, but that's not the end of everything. And so in that context, it was for me the idea that we're seeing a what's obviously supposed to be a feel-good movie because it's funny and action and it's got little kids in it and can't have a sad ending. It's got to find a loophole. Keep that guy over here. Why is every mind control villain in comics a sex offender? It didn't used to be the case at all. So I'm going to have to say, what?
Is that the case now? I don't read enough like modern stuff to know if mind control villains are all sex offenders now.
Yeah, it's definitely a trope. It's common enough that you could still say always. Oh, and it's like it's hinted sometimes. I think some of it has to do with like mind control as the femme fatale, that inversion of propriety, like Poison Ivy, Spellbinder, where you definitely have the idea that something's going on with that. But that in those cases, it's an exaggeration of the idea that women can use their women are already mind controllers.
Controversial question. Possession. If you do something funky in somebody's body while possessing, is that a form of sexual offense?
Ooh. how funky.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
So like yeah. Are you? And I have not read it yet, but I'm aware of it in Swamp Thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Swamp Thing falls in love with Abigail. What's her bucket, right?
Yeah.
And they're a couple, right? They spend all their time together, blah blah blah. And Swamp Thing's based on the mental template of a human person, but obviously doesn't produce, seed, and so, like. John Constantine allows himself to be possessed by Swamp Thing so that they can father a child who somehow still has plant powers, even though that shouldn't make any sense.
Yeah, it shouldn't. But so far, this sounds like everyone involved is consenting, so I don't think that qualifies.
Right. Except that it's consensual, but it's like a. I kind of lean toward the idea that what's it even called anymore? I'm blanking on it. Surrogacy?
Yeah.
It's a good chance that's not ethical.
But I'm talking more like somebody is in somebody else's body against their will, right?
Yeah. Like the Wonder Woman situation, right? Yeah. That's an excellent quote. Excellent point.
And I'm thinking like, even if let's say you were in somebody's body and their wife consented to it, I still feel like there's some type of offense that's been done to the person whose body you're controlling. Like that still qualifies.
I would think so. I would think so. You're robbing like that person of their sexual intimacy. Yeah. I definitely think that there's something on that. There's definitely something in that, because at least from my perspective, like sex isn't just like a physical thing. It's like a spiritual thing. So so you've got that idea on it. As to why, I think it has to do with the fact that there are, in our society, we have like elevated sexual congress to being, in terms of the question, is every mind control villain a sex offender? We have elevated sexual congress to being such a topic of public conversation that we are forced to acknowledge the or we're forced to place sexual transgression at a prominent, as a massively prominent role, right?
Yeah.
Now, sexual transgression is really bad. I'm not trying to say it's not. There are many types of transgression that are bad, that suddenly don't seem so bad when mind control is on the table.
Yeah.
Right? So, like, if you mind control somebody into stealing, okay,
and you can prove that it was mind control, then you're not going to blame the person who stole. You're going to blame the person who mind controlled them.
And then the person who stole who did the stealing under mind control was a victim, but he doesn't necessarily seem like a victim because he's no longer the culprit. So you feel like you're getting off on it. Getting off on it.
You don't want to use that term. That's the other case.
Feel like you're getting away with it.
Yeah.
So the victim is only, so there's no blurry lines there. When you put sex on the table, suddenly like it elevates the victimhood of everybody involved. And I think that becomes a shortcut to drama.
Yeah.
So
I think it's also because you can't reverse it, right? Like you could return something that was stolen. If like somebody gets pregnant involved too, you can't no longer be the father.
Yeah. So, so I think that part of it, the other part of it, we'll probably end up talking about this either next week or the week after, depending on what we find out with it. But when we get back to our discussion of the ages of comics, with the move toward realistic storytelling in comics, in the Bronze Age and after, I think the idea for looking for crimes that have a bigger punch and progressively bigger and bigger punches, to fit in with the real world, I think makes it appealing to look for that. So in the same way that like the whole fridging thing, right? The idea of a superhero's girlfriend being in peril is an instant trick to drama, right? It's an instant path to drama. And so because you're dealing with those kind of stakes. So then when you have this idea of this sexual predation on top of this lack of personal control and agency, it multiplies peril as a shortcut. And so I think it could be a situation of lazy writing. It could also be a statement of the fear of creators or the readers toward a loss of agency, and a way of increasing the drama in the discussion about loss of agency. So that would be my guess.
This has definitely been a trope for a really long time, though, because we can even go back to Dracula. Right.
Well, yeah. The one of the big concepts or aspects in Dracula is the inappropriateness of sexual energy. I mean, not as a whole, but out of place where it's out of place. So you have Lucy, who married but never consummated because she got bit and whatever else, and then approaches her betrothed after death, after her turning, and she's lascivious in a public setting where everybody else is there too. And so suddenly that becomes horribly inappropriate, not because the Lucy and the I can't remember the nobleman's name right now don't belong together, but because of the setting in which it happens and the fact that she's dead.
An alternate version of Dracula where he doesn't actually have any hypnotic powers or anything like that, is that people actually can't control themselves over how magnificent the mustache that he had in the book was. That they cut out of every other version of Dracula.
Yeah, that's a fact. Well, the Eastern, mustaches, magic mustaches.
No, it's like a broom handle on his face.
Wax and everything. So, well, folks, we've been at this for 2 hours and 12 minutes. I think we're out of questions.
And hopefully out of time.
we definitely are out of time. We're over 2 hours, so we just kept going with that last bit. But yeah, so I think that's it. Unless another question pops. Oh, what do we have here? Bye, everybody. Yeah, there you go. We'll call it a night at that point. Either next week or the week after, we're going to be continuing on the Ages of Comics, picking up at the Bronze Age and going from there. We're trying to get all that set up here, and then soon, we'll be figuring out the fall shows.
Now, one of them hopefully will be a Comics Creators Club.
Yeah, hopefully, and we'll definitely be doing one. It's a breakdown of Scott Pilgrim, the entire 6-volume set.
I'm so excited. The trailer was dropped in your Discord. I think it was Evie.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah. Evie dropped it.
Oh, it looks good.
It does not. It does look good. It definitely does not look bad. They captured envy perfectly. I'm gonna have to go ahead and point out that one. Yeah, that's the story. And I don't know. That's all the news I got right now. Oh, hey, if you're still watching, and if you're in Nebraska, Western Nebraska specifically, September 23rd, High Plains Minicon, Scotts Bluff at the mall on the east side of town. Come check it out. It's free. It is also free if you want to have a table. So that's some sad news this week. Number one Marmaduke fan was going to come and had to drop out. So That's a bummer. But yeah, we are setting stuff up for that and excited for it. So that's the thing. Until next time, get out there and read some comics. Later, everybody.